All right, let's look at number 15. We're looking to strengthen the psychologist's argument. So let's read the argument and see if there's any holes that need to be strengthened. So it says that we measure the cognitive plasticity, or basically the ability, the willingness to accept new ideas, of a group of people of both genders and of all ages. And the firstborn children in that study exhibited less of this cognitive plasticity than did their younger siblings. And it's reasonable to think that those who are open to new ideas, which is, in other words, the definition of cognitive plasticity, it's reasonable to think that those who have more cognitive plasticity will be adventurous in other ways. Hence, therefore, our study suggests that siblings of firstborn children, in other words, younger siblings of those firstborn children, will tend to be more adventurous than will the firstborn, the oldest sibling, right? So, very simple argument. The conclusion is that younger siblings are probably more adventurous, and the support for that is that they have more cognitive plasticity. They're willing to accept new ideas. And it's reasonable to assume, says the paragraph, it's reasonable to think that that support would lead to that conclusion, right? That those who have more cognitive plasticity will be more adventurous. So let's find an answer that strengthens that. It's a pretty good argument. There's no hole in the argument. It's pretty solid logic, right? We're saying support, they have more cognitive plasticity, these younger siblings. And conclusion, therefore, they're probably going to be more adventurous, right? Because that's a reasonable thing to think that that would be the case. So let's look for an answer choice that supports that idea, that supports that conclusion, that strengthens it even more, that those younger siblings, because they have more cognitive plasticity, because they're more willing and able to accept new ideas, that they will, in fact, be more adventurous. A says that some of the greatest creative geniuses of all time were firstborn children. That doesn't strengthen our argument. That's the opposite of what we're saying, right? We're trying to prove that the younger siblings are more adventurous. A is going in the other direction. Now, it doesn't really weaken the argument either, because just because there's some people that are outliers to a specific correlation doesn't mean that that correlation doesn't exist. But at any rate, it certainly doesn't strengthen the argument because it's giving you something that goes against what the argument is suggesting. It's telling you that there are some creative geniuses that were firstborn children. We're trying to argue that the younger siblings are going to be the ones that are more adventurous, assuming that there's even an equation between being adventurous and being a creative genius, which also is assumption anyway. So there's a few reasons why A just simply does not pertain and does not strengthen the argument. B is interesting because B says that in most cases, most of the time, the more younger siblings that you have, in other words, the higher up that you are in your sibling group, the more younger siblings you have, the greater your cognitive plasticity is. This would seem to kind of go against the paragraph because the paragraph is saying that the younger siblings have more cognitive plasticity, right? So B doesn't literally contradict with that because B is kind of saying the more younger siblings you have, the greater your cognitive plasticity is. Now, according to the paragraph, even though that's the case, we know it's still less, though, than the cognitive plasticity of your younger siblings. According to the paragraph, we know that they have you beat when it comes to cognitive plasticity. But B just says that you, as the older sibling, the more younger siblings that you have, your cognitive plasticity is going to go up at least slightly. Here's the thing. This has nothing to do with our conclusion anyway, right? Because our conclusion is trying to say that there's a connection between that and being more adventurous in other ways. So B is kind of going in circles with who has cognitive plasticity among the siblings and whether you have more or less cognitive plasticity. But okay, great. We already know at the end of the day that younger siblings have more cognitive plasticity. You're not going to change that fact. We have to now get from there to saying that therefore they must be more adventurous. That would be relevant to our conclusion if we could prove that connection. So B doesn't do that, doesn't do anything for us, so it's not the right answer. C says that we looked at other studies and it turns out that there's a correlation between cognitive plasticity, this thing that we are arguing is going to make people more adventurous. C is saying that there's a correlation, it turns out, between that and the willingness to take risks, which is another way of saying the willingness to be adventurous, right? That's exactly what we're looking for. C says that there actually is this correlation. The paragraph just said it's reasonable to think. It's reasonable to think that probably those who are open to new ideas are also going to be more adventurous. They're going to take more risks, right? And then we just kind of went on a hunch. C strengthens the argument because C says your hunch is correct. Turns out we actually did other studies. It turns out there actually is a correlation between cognitive plasticity and the willingness to take risks, to be more adventurous. So that directly strengthens the link between our support and our conclusion. Very, very simple, correct answer. D tells us that a study of business executives shows that a few people who are industry leaders have older siblings. Now, this is not strong enough to help us out here for several reasons. First of all, who says that being an industry leader has anything to do with being adventurous? Maybe the way you become an industry leader is not by being adventurous, meaning it probably is in real life, but who knows? In this context of this question, we've never been told that. Maybe you become an industry leader by being very conservative and not taking risks and not being adventurous, right? So we don't know if there's any connection to what we're trying to prove. And even if we did know that, several, right? The word several should always tip you off when you're dealing with proving some kind of, mass statistical correlation or connection between two things. Just because several people, several industry leaders have older siblings, that doesn't mean that it's a disproportionate amount, because maybe several industry leaders don't have older siblings. Maybe they're firstborns, right? Maybe there's even more industry leaders that don't have older siblings than the ones that do have older siblings. So just because a few people have this thing doesn't prove anything in terms of any connection between those things, right? And so therefore, this is not going to help us out for a couple of reasons, right? Maybe their older siblings, maybe these industry leaders that have older siblings, maybe their older siblings are also industry leaders. Maybe they're even bigger industry leaders than the younger siblings are. So this doesn't help us out. It doesn't prove that cognitive plasticity is going to be connected with being more adventurous. E tells us that this study that we're using to base the argument off of is not necessarily representative of the population at large, because it says most of the people in this study characterize themselves as more adaptable than other people, right? So the people in the study think, for the most part, they think that they have more cognitive plasticity than the average person. Now, first of all, anything that tells you that the study's not representative of the human race is not going to strengthen the argument, because the argument is trying to make a conclusion based off of this study. And if you tell me, well, the study doesn't represent people properly, it represents only a small subset of people that are not indicative of what the whole population looks like, that's not going to strengthen the argument. If anything, that's going to weaken the argument, because it's going to show you that your study was unrepresentative of the species of humans that you're trying to make a conclusion based off of, right? But even beyond that, we don't know, meaning just because they characterize themselves as more adaptable, it simply is so far removed from having to do with our conclusion. The study already told us younger siblings are more adaptable, right? They have more cognitive plasticity than the firstborn does. So we already know that. Now, E is just telling us a tidbit. It's telling us a fact about whether they thought they were more adaptable than the average person or whether they didn't. That's neither here nor there, because we're trying to get from this whole concept of cognitive plasticity, we're trying to prove whether or not there's a connection between that and being more adventurous, taking more risks. That's the conclusion. That's what we really care about. So E is kind of just going in circles with the whole cognitive plasticity thing. We already have all the information we need in terms of that from this study. The question is, does that prove that younger siblings are more adventurous, or does it not? That's what we're concerned with. E has nothing to do with that conclusion of this argument, so it's not going to help us out. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.